The city outside was a living, breathing thing, all blinking lights and hurried sounds, but inside the small apartment above the quiet bookshop, the world had shrunk to a single, suffocating silence. This was supposed to be Aris Valente's wedding day. There should have been laughter, the rustle of a beautiful white dress, and the warm, happy tears of a father. Instead, the only sound was the soft, broken sob that escaped Aris's lips as she stared at her reflection in the simple, full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, dressed not in a gown of her choosing, but in a sleek, expensive ivory dress that felt as cold and foreign as the situation she found herself in. It was a dress bought for a transaction, not a celebration. Her father, Mr. Valente, stood in the doorway, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a guilt so heavy it seemed to bend his very frame. He was a good man, a gentle man who had spent his life surrounded by the peaceful, inky worlds of stories. But the real world, with its sharp edges and cruel demands, had finally crashed through his bookshop door. He watched his daughter, his only child, the one bright light in his life, and felt his heart crack. "Aris," he began, his voice a rough whisper, thick with unshed tears. "My dear, sweet Aris. Please believe me. If there had been any other way." Aris turned from the mirror, her eyes, usually the color of warm honey, now dark pools of confusion and fear. "Another way to do what, Papa?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To sell your daughter to a stranger? To the most feared man in this city." The name hung in the air between them, a dark and dangerous shadow. Dante Moretti, heir to the Moretti family. A name spoken in whispers, a legend of power and violence. He was not a man, he was a warning. Her father took a hesitant step into the room, his hands fluttering uselessly at his sides. "It wasn't a sale, Aris. It was a settlement. A protection." He explained, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush, how a bad investment, a loan from the wrong people, had spiraled into an impossible debt. The kind of debt that wasn't settled with money alone, but with loyalty. With blood. He had been given a choice: give his daughter in marriage to Dante Moretti, binding their family to the powerful Morettis and thus erasing the debt, or lose everything. Including her safety. The drive to the city hall was a silent, blurry procession. Aris sat in the back of the sleek, black car, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, staring out at the passing streets without really seeing them. She felt like a piece of cargo, being delivered to a new owner. The man sent to escort them, a serious-faced young man named Elio, had been polite but distant. He opened doors for her, called her Miss Valente with a respectful nod, but his eyes were constantly moving, scanning the environment for threats. He was a living reminder that she was now stepping into a world where danger was a constant companion. They did not go to a church. They went to a private, wood-paneled room in the city hall that felt more like a boardroom than a place for vows. It was empty save for a few stern-looking men in sharp suits and the official who would perform the ceremony. And then, he was there. Dante Moretti. He stood near the front of the room, his back to her as they entered. He was taller than she had imagined, his shoulders broad beneath his impeccably tailored black suit. He turned, and Aris's breath caught in her throat. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and dark, intense eyes that seemed to see right through her. But his handsomeness was like that of a finely crafted weapon, beautiful, but cold and deadly. There was no warmth in his gaze, no smile on his lips. He looked at her not with the awe of a groom, but with the calm assessment of a man finalizing a business contract. The ceremony was swift and devoid of emotion. Aris repeated the words she was told to repeat, her voice a hollow echo in the quiet room. Her hand trembled as Dante slid a heavy, stunning diamond band onto her finger. His touch was brief, his fingers cool against her skin. When it was his turn to speak his vows, his voice was low and steady, devoid of any feeling. He was not pledging his heart, he was stating a fact. She was now his. The official pronounced them husband and wife. Dante leaned in. Aris flinched, bracing for the kiss that would seal this terrible bargain. But his lips only brushed her cheek, a dry, perfunctory touch that felt more dismissive than affectionate. The entire event had taken less than 10 minutes. The car ride to his home, a colossal, modern mansion perched on a cliff overlooking the city, was even quieter than the first. Dante did not speak to her. He spent the entire journey on his phone, speaking in low, clipped tones about things she didn't understand. Aris kept her face turned toward the window, watching the city lights grow smaller and more distant, feeling herself being pulled further and further away from the life she knew. The house was a fortress of glass and steel, beautiful but utterly lifeless. It was spotlessly clean, filled with expensive art, but it felt more like a museum than a home. A kind, older housekeeper showed Aris to her room. Her room. Not their room. It was a lavish suite, with a huge bed and a breathtaking view of the ocean. But the door felt like the border to a new country, one where she was a prisoner of a gilded cage. She changed into a simple, modest nightgown, her movements slow and heavy. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed, listening to the silence of the house, and waited. She knew what was expected to happen next. It was the wedding night. It was the final part of the transaction. The soft knock on the door, when it came, made her jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clutched the collar of her nightgown, her knuckles turning white. "Come in," she whispered, the words barely audible. The door opened and Dante stood there, still in his suit pants and a white dress shirt, the top buttons undone. He looked tired. He looked at her, sitting there on the bed, so small and fragile against the large pillows, her eyes wide with pure, undiluted terror. He saw the way she shook. He saw the way she looked at him not as her husband, but as her executioner. For a long moment, he just stood there, his dark eyes taking in the scene. The fear in the room was a tangible thing, thick and suffocating. And then, something in his hardened expression shifted. A crack appeared in the cold, impenetrable wall he presented to the world. A deep sadness, an ancient weariness, clouded his gaze. He let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. He took a single step into the room, but no further. "Aris," he said, and her name on his lips sounded different than it had at the ceremony. Softer. "Look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his. "I see the fear in your eyes," he continued, his voice low and quiet, meant only for her. "I see you looking at me like I am a monster from one of your storybooks." He paused, choosing his words with a care she would not have thought him capable of. "I am many things. I am a businessman. I am the heir to my family's legacy. I can be ruthless. I can be cruel to those who deserve it. But I am not a monster who takes what is not freely given." Aris stared at him, her breath caught in her throat, unable to believe what she was hearing. "This marriage began as an arrangement," he said. "But it does not have to continue as one. Not like this." He took a deep breath, and in that moment, he looked less like a Mafia Heir and more like a man making the most important vow of his life. "I make you a promise tonight, Aris. I will not touch you. I will not come to your bed. I will wait." He took a step back toward the door, his eyes never leaving hers. "I will wait until you look at me and do not see a monster. I will wait until you can stand in the same room with me and not tremble. I will wait until you want me. Until you ask me." With that, he gave her one last, long look, filled with a strange, unreadable emotion. Then, he stepped back into the hallway and closed the door with a soft, final click. The sound echoed in the silent room. Aris was left alone, sitting on the bed, the echo of his words swirling around her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now, something else was there too, something small and fragile and bewildering. A tiny, impossible seed of hope. The monster had just promised to be a gentleman. And for the first time that day, Aris Valente, now Aris Moretti, felt a single, real tear roll down her cheek, not entirely born of sorrow. The days that followed her wedding settled into a strange and silent rhythm, a new life painted in shades of gray and gold. The mansion, for all its intimidating size and luxury, became a map of two separate worlds. Aris's world was the sunlit library with its floor-to-ceiling windows, the private garden where she would sit for hours with a book, and the echoing silence of her own bedroom suite. Dante's world was the sound of his study door closing, the low murmur of his voice on business calls that always ceased when she entered a room, and the glimpse of his retreating back as he left the house in the dead of night. They were two planets orbiting the same sun, close enough to feel the other's gravity, yet never touching, separated by the cold vacuum of their arrangement. He was not unkind. In fact, his politeness was a constant, meticulous wall. He provided for her in a way that was almost overwhelming. A first-edition copy of her favorite novel, the one she had casually mentioned missing from her father's shop, appeared on the library desk one morning. A wardrobe was filled with clothes of the finest silk and cashmere, all in her exact size, the color subtle and elegant. He ensured she had every physical comfort, yet the man himself remained a ghost in his own home. Their paths would cross at dinner, a formal affair where they sat at opposite ends of a table long enough to seat 20. The clink of silverware was the loudest sound in the room. He would ask her if she needed anything, his tone that of a hotel manager checking on a valued guest. She would reply that she was fine, her voice small in the vast space. Then the silence would descend once more, heavy and profound. It was in this silence that Aris began to notice things. She started to see the small, almost invisible cracks in the perfect facade of Dante Moretti. She noticed the way his shoulders would slump with a deep, weary exhaustion when he thought no one was looking, the way he would rub his temples as if trying to erase a permanent pain. She saw the way he spoke to his elderly housekeeper, Maria, his voice dropping into a tone of genuine respect and care that he never used with anyone else. He once quietly ensured her son was given a job within his organization, a small act of mercy that Aris overheard from the hallway. This was not the action of the heartless monster she had been taught to fear. This was the action of a man who understood loyalty, who felt a sense of responsibility for those under his protection. The first real fracture in the wall between them happened on a rainy afternoon. Bored and curious, Aris mustered her courage and approached his study, a room she had come to think of as his forbidden fortress. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, finding the room empty. It was exactly as she imagined, dark woods, shelves of ledgers, a massive desk. But on that desk, sitting apart from the neat stacks of paper, was a small, simple silver frame. Inside the frame was a faded photograph. It showed a young boy, no more than 10, with a wide, unguarded smile, his arm wrapped around the waist of a beautiful woman with kind eyes and dark, curling hair. The boy was unmistakably Dante. The woman, his mother. Aris was staring at this relic of a happier past when a shadow fell over the desk. Dante stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to a flash of raw, startling anger. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was sharp, a whip crack in the quiet room. Aris flinched, her old fears surging back. She stepped away from the desk, her heart pounding. But as quickly as the anger had come, it vanished from his face, replaced by something else, regret, and a deep, haunting sorrow. He saw her flinch. He looked from her terrified face to the photograph in her hand, and the fight seemed to drain out of him completely. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet now, rough with emotion. "I didn't mean to shout." He walked over and gently took the photograph from her trembling hand, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second, sending an unexpected jolt through her. He looked down at the picture, his thumb tracing the glass over his mother's face. "Her name was Isabella," he said, the name a soft prayer. "She was, like you, gentle. She loved music and gardens. She hated the violence." He didn't look at Aris as he spoke, his gaze locked on the photograph. "This world, my family's world, it consumed her. It broke her. She was a light that was never meant to shine in such a dark place." In that moment, he wasn't the feared Mafia Heir. He was just a boy who had lost his mother, a man still carrying that loss like a shard of glass in his heart. He placed the frame back on the desk with a finality that felt like closing a tomb. He had given her a piece of his past, and the weight of that trust settled heavily on Aris, changing the way she saw him forever. The second, more violent crack in their fragile world came without warning weeks later. It was deep in the heart of a moonless night. Aris was awakened not by a sound, but by a feeling, a primal sense of wrongness that seeped into the mansion's very foundations. Then came the shouts, sharp and guttural. The splintering crash of breaking glass. The unmistakable, terrifying pop-pop-pop of gunfire somewhere downstairs. Her blood ran cold. She scrambled out of bed, her mind screaming with panic, frozen in the center of her dark room. This was it. This was the violence he was part of, crashing into her sanctuary. Her door flew open so hard it slammed against the wall. Dante stood there, silhouetted by the hallway light. He wasn't in pajamas. He was in black trousers and a t-shirt, and in his hand was a gun, a terrifying extension of his arm. His eyes were not cold now, they were blazing with a ferocious, predatory intensity. But when his gaze found her, huddled and terrified in her nightgown, that ferocity shifted, refocused. "Aris," he barked, his voice a command that cut through her fear. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't stop to explain. In one swift, powerful motion, he grabbed her, one arm wrapping around her waist, the other, the one holding the gun, cradling her head protectively against his chest. He pulled her down to the floor, behind the solid barrier of her bed, his large body shielding hers completely. She could feel the hard, unyielding strength of him, the rapid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She could smell the clean scent of his skin, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of gunpowder. "Don't move," he whispered into her hair, his voice a low, vibrating rumble in his chest. "Don't make a sound." She clung to him, her fingers clutching the fabric of his shirt. The world outside was chaos, more shouts, the sound of running feet, Elio's voice yelling commands. But here, in this small space behind the bed, wrapped in Dante's arms, there was a terrifying, electrifying safety. He was the danger, but he was also her only protection. The monster was her shield. Just as suddenly as it began, the chaos subsided. An eerie quiet fell, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Elio appeared at the door, his own gun lowered. "It's clear, Dante. They're gone. We got them all." Dante's grip on her did not loosen immediately. He slowly raised his head, his body still tense, coiled like a spring ready to unleash more violence if needed. He looked down at Aris, still pressed against him. The fierce protectiveness in his eyes softened into a look of profound concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. Aris could only shake her head, her eyes wide as she looked up at him. The fear was still there, a cold echo in her veins, but it was now mixed with something else, something warm and confusing and powerful. He had run to her first. His first and only thought had been to protect her. As he helped her to her feet, his hands gentle on her arms, she didn't see a monster anymore. She saw a man. A dangerous, complicated, powerful man, but a man who had just risked his own safety to cover her body with his. Without thinking, driven by a surge of overwhelming emotion, she reached up and gently touched the side of his face, her fingertips resting against the rough stubble on his jaw. Dante went perfectly still, his dark eyes widening in shock. He leaned into her touch, just for a heartbeat, closing his eyes as if her hand was a benediction he had been starving for. A spark, hot and undeniable, passed between them in the silent, charged air. The wall was no longer just cracked. It had been shattered, and through the broken pieces, they finally saw each other. The silence in the mansion the next morning was different. It was no longer the cold, empty quiet of two strangers coexisting, but a thick, heavy, and charged stillness, filled with the unspoken memory of the night before. The air itself seemed to hum with the echo of gunfire and the ghost of a touch, her hand on his face, the solid strength of his body shielding hers. When Aris walked into the breakfast room, she found Dante already there, standing by the window, a cup of coffee forgotten in his hand. He turned as she entered, and the look that passed between them was not one of polite distance, but a long, deep, searching gaze that held 1,000 questions. He saw the trust in her eyes where there had once been only fear. She saw the raw, unprotected vulnerability in his where there had once been only ice. He did not shy away from what had happened. Over a breakfast that was no longer silent, his voice was low and earnest as he explained the world she had been thrust into. He spoke of the Rossi family, a rival clan locked in a bloody feud with the Morettis for generations. The attack had been a message from them, a violent objection to the marriage that had secured the Valente debt and strengthened the Moretti name. "You are a target now, Aris, because you are my wife," he said, his eyes dark with a grim responsibility. "Your safety is my single most important priority. From this moment on, you will have a guard with you at all times. Elio will be your shadow. And for now, we must not leave these grounds." He was no longer just a husband, he was her protector in a war she never knew existed. This new reality of forced proximity became the catalyst that finally broke down the last of the walls between them. With the outside world locked away, the vast mansion became their entire universe. They began to spend their days together, not as prisoner and warden, but as two people slowly, carefully discovering one another. Dante would work in his study, and Aris would read in the armchair by the fireplace, the quiet companionship a balm to both their lonely souls. He started asking her about her books, and she, in turn, began to ask about his work, not the violent parts, but the complex business of it all. She discovered he had a sharp, dry wit, and one evening, she said something that made him laugh, a real, genuine, unguarded laugh that transformed his entire face. The sound of it echoed in the room, and Aris felt a strange, warm triumph bloom in her chest. She had made the monster laugh. Evenings were spent talking by the grand fireplace, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across the room. They spoke of their childhoods, of lost dreams and quiet hopes. He told her more about his mother, and she spoke of her own, of a life that had been simple and filled with love. The space between them on the sofa grew smaller each night. One evening, as a thunderstorm raged outside, Aris found herself looking at him, truly looking, and the last remnants of her fear melted away, replaced by a feeling so vast and profound it stole her breath. She saw a man who carried the weight of a legacy he never asked for, a man who was starved for genuine connection, a man who, despite his power, had chosen to be gentle with her. "Dante," she said, her voice soft but clear over the sound of the rain. He turned from the fire, his eyes meeting hers. "I want to thank you," she continued. For keeping your promise. For protecting me. For everything. She took a slow breath, her heart hammering. I was wrong about you. I see that now. Dante's gaze was intense, the firelight reflecting in the dark depths of his eyes. He moved closer, his presence a warm, magnetic force. My promise still stands, Aris, he whispered, his voice a low, intimate rumble that vibrated through her. It will always stand. I will only ever come to you when you ask me. When you want me. The air crackled between them, thick with a tension that was no longer born of fear, but of a desperate, aching desire. The space between their lips was mere inches, a bridge neither of them yet crossed. The unspoken question hung in the air, did she want him? Later that night, lying alone in the darkness of her lavish bedroom, Aris knew the answer. The question was not a question anymore, it was a certainty that pulsed in her blood with every beat of her heart. The fear was gone. In its place was a deep, thrilling ache, a need to be close to him, to bridge the final distance between them. She thought of his laughter, his protective embrace, the sorrow in his eyes when he spoke of his mother, the respect in his voice when he spoke to her. She loved him. She loved Dante Moretti. And love cast out all fear. With a resolve that felt both terrifying and right, she pushed back the silken sheets. She walked across the cool floor, her bare feet making no sound. She opened her bedroom door and walked the short, dark distance to his. She stood there for a moment, her hand poised to knock, her entire body trembling not from cold or fear, but from anticipation. Then, she knocked, 3 soft, decisive taps. The door opened almost immediately, as if he had been waiting, awake in the dark. Dante stood there, his hair slightly disheveled, his chest bare, wearing only a pair of sleep pants. His eyes were wide, searching her face in the dim light, filled with a mixture of hope and burning need. Aris? He breathed, his voice husky with sleep and emotion. She looked up at him, her expression open, her heart in her eyes. All the words she had practiced vanished, leaving only the pure, simple truth. Please, Dante, she whispered, her voice steady and clear. Just one night. Don't make me sleep alone anymore. For a heartbeat, he was perfectly still, as if her words had turned him to stone. Then, a shudder ran through his powerful frame. The control he had held onto so tightly for weeks, the promise he had sworn to keep, finally snapped. A low, guttural sound escaped him, a mix of relief and raw, unleashed passion. He reached out, his hand not grabbing, but inviting. He gently took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, and slowly, reverently, pulled her across the threshold into his room. He led her to the center of the room and turned to face her, his free hand coming up to cradle her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a tenderness that made her eyes well with tears. Are you sure? He asked, his voice a raw whisper, his dark eyes boring into hers, needing one final confirmation. Are you absolutely sure, my love? This time, Aris did not hesitate. She nodded, a single, definitive movement. Yes, she breathed. I want you. I want this. I want us. That was all he needed. The last of his restraint vanished. He bent his head and his lips found hers in a kiss that was not gentle, but was filled with a lifetime of hunger and a depth of feeling that shook them both to their core. It was a kiss of claiming, and of surrender. It was a kiss that held all the words they had not yet spoken, a silent vow more binding than any they had made in that city hall. The world of feuds and danger fell away, leaving only the two of them, finally, gloriously, one. The promise had been kept, and a new, more powerful one had begun in its place, a promise of a love that was stronger than any fear, a future they would face together, no matter what darkness awaited outside their door. Did this story capture your heart? If you felt the tension, the passion, and the emotional journey of Aris and Dante, then you won't want to miss what happens next. Their story is far from over. Subscribe now for more unforgettable, heart-pounding romances that will keep you captivated until the very last word.